Hi, I'm Stephen Prince, the author of The Warrior's Camera, the cinema of Akira Kurosawa. Ikiru is one of Kurosawa's most loved films. Kurosawa explores a timeless issue, the approach of death and the meaning of being alive. This gives the film its universal themes and appeal, but Ikiru is also a pointed depiction of Japan at a turbulent time in its history. This is the last film in a series of works by Kurosawa on the nation's post-war collapse and reconstruction. From this very specific context, Kurosawa creates a timeless portrait. He was at the height of his powers when he made Ikiru. The year before, in 1951, he hit the big time when Rashomon won an international prize at Venice. Between then and 1965, he enjoyed the best part of his career, during which he made a lot of superlative films. But the high point was undoubtedly 1952 and 1953, when he made Ikiru and then launched into the production of Seven Samurai, his next film giving us as back-to-back productions his two masterpieces. This is Kurosawa's 13th film as a director, and one reason that it's such a mature work is that the Kurosawa company is in place, the team of collaborators that he would rely on in picture after picture. Screenwriters Shinobu Hashimoto and Hideo Oguni, who was scripting his first Kurosawa film and who made an enormous contribution that I'll talk about a bit later. Script supervisor Teruya Nagami, sound designer Fumio Yanaguchi, composer and very close friend Fumio Hayasaka, cinematographer Asakazu Nakai, and assisting him Takao Saito, who would be the principal cinematographer on the color films, and Yoshiro Muraki, who would be Kurosawa's great production designer, and who on this film was assisting art director Shu Matsuyama. Kurosawa's narrative design in Ikiru is quite radical. Most movies about terminal disease play up the pathos of the situation. They're full of sentimentality and try to get us to feel sorry for the victim. But Kurosawa keeps us at some distance, using a narrator to introduce Watanabe, our central character.
これはこの物語の主人公の胃袋である。
As you can hear, the narration is very cool and emotionless, and Kurosawa will use it as a presentational device that he shifts to when he wants to take us out of the story. He'll jump around in time and use a lot of different perspectives on the story rather than giving us a straightforward tale with the main character that we're asked to identify with. So the result is a film with no false sentimentality. We've started with a close-up of the X-ray of Watanabe's cancer, and a lot of critics have said that by going into the film this way, Kurosawa is defining Watanabe in terms of his disease. True enough, but Kurosawa has always felt that it's crisis that defines character. This sign above the desk alludes to the post-war reforms that were implemented under the Allied occupation of Japan's civil service system, which aimed to democratize it and make it more responsive to local communities and problems. With savage irony, Kurosawa will show us the failure of these ideals. Kurosawa will be looking inward at his main character and outward at his society. Ikiru offers a devastating social critique of post-war Japan. It's important to note here the mother's remark about her child's skin rash. It points to the illnesses related to poor living conditions that were so common in the aftermath of the war. The social infrastructure had been destroyed, with many health-related consequences. Tokyo children suffered not only skin rashes, but intestinal parasites. A survey of Tokyo schoolchildren conducted in 1951, for example, showed that 51% had these parasites, and in some areas of town it was as high as 72%. So the well-being of the children, a big part of the film's theme, gives us a way of measuring post-war recovery. We're seeing some of the wonderful effects created here by Yoshiro Muraki's sets. The architecture of these scenes at the town hall carved the space in the frame up into very small, isolated areas. People often face in different directions, and they're isolated from one another by furniture, shelving, and stacks of paper, as you can see here, this enormous pile of papers between the two characters in the background. The sets visualize alienation and entrapment, and Kurosawa's cameras will be exploiting these metaphors throughout the film. Ikiru has one of its sources in Tolstoy's novella, The Death of Ivan Ilyich, which relates the horrendous death through cancer of a petty mid-level judge who has led the kind of unimaginative ordinary life that we see in Watanabe. Kurosawa told his screenwriter that he wanted to do a film like what Tolstoy had written about in this book. The novella was published in 1884 and emerged from Tolstoy's anxieties about dying and his torment about the questions that death inevitably poses for life. Kurosawa loved Russian literature. In fact, just prior to Ikiru, he made an adaptation of Dostoevsky's The Idiot. This plan to increase office efficiency is another device that comments on the Allied occupation period. Public administration was restructured to make it more efficient and democratic, and in 1951, the local public service law enshrined the ideal of public employees as servants of the community. In contrast to these ideals, though, Watanabe's plan is so much waste paper now. Although his plan predates the war, its inclusion here suggests that the Allied reforms have not taken root. It also gets to a great problem at the core of Japanese bureaucracy. As the narrator tells us, doing nothing is the best way for Watanabe to keep up his position. Similarly, Masao Miyamoto, who was a deputy director in Japan's Ministry of Health and Welfare, wrote that the three great principles of Japanese bureaucracy are: don't be late, don't take time off, and do no work. We're about to return to the mothers who are still at the front desk, and when we do so, Kurosawa is going to launch into one of the film's most brilliant sequences. In fact, there are two fabulous montages in the film, each among the very best work that he's ever created. This one, which is savagely funny and bitter, shows the mothers getting the runaround. It takes the abstract ideas that the narrator has been describing and makes them more concrete, showing them in a very powerful and unforgettable way that shows just how inhuman the bureaucracy is. Kurosawa is giving us 16 wipes, using his favorite editing device, and at first he's alternating groups of wipes going to the left and the right, but then he's going to be finishing with 7 wipes all moving to the left, suggesting in a kind of subliminal way what the images are showing more directly, namely, the mothers face a crushingly uniform response. The bureaucracy is united in its indifference to their plea. Notice that the mothers are all absent from these shots. The design is rather unusual. We understand that they are off camera. The visual attention is all concentrated on the officials, as each one is essentially seeking to do no work. Most of the shots in the montage are relatively brief. This one, though, is a little longer, and you can see that Kurosawa's taken some compositional care with that background behind the official. The slats in the window carve up that area in a way that makes it very difficult to really see what's out there. It's some kind of heavy equipment. You can see a tire and piece of an engine, but it's hard to assemble it in a coherent way. The result of all of these individual shots of the bureaucrats is to compile an assembly which is basically a rogues gallery of scoundrels, and it culminates with this guy here, giving us a splendid movie villain's laugh. Coming up. There it is. Kurosawa's being a little bit tongue-in-cheek here, and that takes us into the deputy director's office. This is actor Nobuo Nakamura, making a wonderful weasel's appearance as the director. Kurosawa liked using Nakamura in roles like this, playing oily, duplicitous officials. He casts him again this way in later pictures like The Bad Sleep Well and High and Low. All of these bureaucrats seeking to do no work are in sharp contrast to the group of mothers who are rebellious and somewhat non-traditional in their assertiveness, certainly for women in Japan at this time, and this makes their alliance later in the film with Watanabe a very natural one. Their assertiveness is evident in the remark that one is about to make, namely, there's no democracy here. That remark alludes to, again, the reforms of the occupation. Ikiru was made during this interval when the Allies were in Japan from 1945 to 1952. And Kurosawa found the ideals then of democracy and individualism that the reforms were pushing to be of great personal inspiration, but he had a pessimistic sense they'd be very difficult to implement. He shows this difficulty in the film's social setting, the bureaucracy, and the mother's remark suggests that the reforms have failed. This remark probably would have been rejected by the Allied film censors, who were opposed to anything in films that might seem critical of the reforms. But in fact, their program of censorship ended shortly after Ikiru went into production. Kurosawa now gives us a surprise. The clerk tells the mothers that Watanabe is absent. He hasn't come in. This is a little startling because the film's continuity has implied a unity of time. Our introduction to Watanabe was intercut with the mother's petition at the front desk, and then the montage as they're shunted from person to person, all perfectly continuous, or so we have assumed. Now, though, we learn that the story has jumped over some interval of time. How much exactly we can't say, but enough to account for Watanabe suddenly being absent. And it's going to be part of a larger narrative and thematic pattern, whereby Kurosawa leaps over chunks of time and space and takes Watanabe away from us. He creates a lot of dislocations in the story centering on Watanabe and makes him a little bit of a mysterious character. We've got 4 relatively lengthy shots now in which Watanabe's co-workers speculate about where he might be and why. I love this composition in particular, this enormous stack of papers here that dwarfs the 2 clerks behind it. This series of queries becomes a recurring motif in the film. His co-workers and family members are going to be inventing a series of explanations to try to make sense of what to them is baffling behavior. Because Watanabe is really going to be rejecting all of the conventional sources of meaning that define their lives and that have defined his life. Once he learns that he has cancer, he becomes rather subversive. And rather than see this for what it is, everyone tries to rationalize his behavior in very conventional ways. Again, Kurosawa shows us how brilliant he is with composition. Look at the beam there separating those 2 characters. Now we're at the hospital, and I've always found this dissolve coming up here to be a rather strange one. Right there, it's a little bit disorienting because the background change isn't big enough. It's a little bit confusing about where he is. Now that dissolve that we just saw is much better. Those 2 backgrounds clearly don't match, and so the transition works quite well. I'm not suggesting that this was a bad edit. It's a strange one, though. This is an interesting detail here from the standpoint of sanitary practices. We see these 2 guys drinking from the same metal cup at the hospital. This splendid long take is going to run for 2.5 minutes, and it's shot with the kind of conventional deep focus that one almost never sees again in Kurosawa's work after this picture. You can see we've got foreground character, midground, and background, and look at how they move perfectly in sync. Starting with his next picture, Seven Samurai, Kurosawa began to discard wide-angle lenses and favor the use of telephoto lenses, and he kept on working that way thereafter. So here we've got a kind of composition that's going to be disappearing from Kurosawa's work. Our background character gets up to leave, and Kurosawa reblocks the action to keep things symmetrical. The actor now moving around into the background is Atsushi Watanabe, a regular player that Kurosawa used in a number of his films, and whose most notable appearance will be in Yojimbo, where he plays the coffin maker. Kurosawa will be choreographing the action in this long take to keep it very lively, and he's going to be changing the blocking of the actors in significant ways that point to Watanabe's growing agitation. We're going to bring a background character in now, this elderly woman, and she'll sit down there on the left to fill up that little area of space. As this patient's description starts to become distressingly familiar to Watanabe, describing symptoms that Watanabe knows that he himself has, he's going to move increasingly into the foreground, and we'll see Kurosawa taking advantage of wide-angle lens capabilities. Here he goes. He's going to move away a few inches, as if by moving away from this information, somehow that's going to protect him. In the future, when Kurosawa would do a shot like this, he would zoom in from a great distance and flatten the image, rather than giving us this kind of spatial depth. Now he's got Shimura's face very close to the lens of the camera. And again, we never see this kind of image after this film in his work. The descriptions become more sinister yet, and When the patient begins talking about the blackened stool, Fumio Hayasaka's music becomes quite ominous and dirge-like and plays Watanabe's mortal dread quite explicitly. A fade and the dirge continues over this brilliant long shot, showing us frames within the frame and Watanabe in the distance, brooding and frightened. A lot of the action in these scenes is calibrated as a musical rhythm. Watanabe stands up, for example, on the beat of the music, and he drops his coat. He drops it again in the next scene when the doctor gives him the code for cancer by talking about a light ulcer. There's another piece of information that Kurosawa has leaped over. We don't know, for example, why Watanabe has come to the hospital on this day. What is it that prompted him to suddenly, after so many years, take time off from work? That's one of the things that makes Watanabe a bit of a mysterious character in the film. We don't have all the information about him, particularly critical information, that we need. This becomes an important motif in the film, that kind of close-up of his face, the deep focus shot that stresses the intensity of his reaction. Kurosawa pans to isolate him in the frame, and when he gets the news, there goes the coat, as Hayasaka's musical theme is reprised. This wonderful deep focus shot of Watanabe absorbing the news is played with him toward the camera, the composition stressing his disconnection from other people in the frame. In this way, the image describes one of the deepest ironies in the film, and it's one that derives from the death of Ivan Ilyich, namely that Watanabe's suffering will cut him off from others. The aspect of the scene that may be most puzzling to a Western viewer is the way that the doctor conceals Watanabe's cancer from him. But it's a detail that reflects Japanese medical practice. In the 1950s and thereafter, a policy of non-disclosure prevailed. Doctors didn't tell their cancer patients, and the patients didn't want to know. Cancer was regarded as a death sentence, and everyone felt that knowing about it would be so debilitating that the disease would actually worsen. Even as recently as the 1980s, Japanese medical journals were debating the wisdom of this practice. So what we see in the scene is exactly what was occurring in doctors' offices across Japan. It's a piece of tacit information that Japanese audiences would have understood perfectly, but which for a Western viewer requires a little bit of context. This wipe takes us to the scene's coda, and the doctor poses the movie's central question. Watanabe's only got about 6 months at the most to live, and if that was you, what would you do? This young doctor in the background, on the left of the screen, is played by actor Ko Kimura, who played the villain in Stray Dog in 1949, and whom Kurosawa would next cast as Kotushiro, the youngest of the Seven Samurai. In fact, we've got 5 of the Seven Samurai appearing in this film, and I'll point them out as they appear. He looks at the X-ray and we see that mass of cancer there, again defining Watanabe in terms of this disease. Now we go into a startlingly brilliant sequence, as Kurosawa uses sound in a subjective way. It's the kind of unusual sound-image combination that he explored with sound designer Fumio Yanaguchi. At first we think perhaps the audio is just very unobtrusive, but then when Watanabe is almost flattened by the truck, Kurosawa brings it in full bore, and we realize that we've been inside Watanabe's head, staring fixedly and obsessively ahead, oblivious of his surroundings. This wipe takes us to the new scene and a tracking shot toward the house. It's now the second point in the film where Kurosawa plays tricks on us. A likely assumption we've made is that this is Watanabe returning home after the hospital, and that this is his point of view shot as he approaches the house. Instead, it's a point of view that belongs to characters we haven't yet met. Kurosawa again has jumped over an interval of time, unanticipated by us, and he's taken Watanabe away from us. The old man is already at home, waiting for his son to arrive. This is the point of view of his son and son's wife. Mitsu and his wife complain about having to come home to such a run-down place, and they plan ways to buy their own, more elegant private home. They represent the spirit of post-war acquisitiveness that Kurosawa condemns in this film, as he has in many of his others. He has portrayed this post-war generation very harshly in his work. Although the post-war economic boom in Japan did not get underway until 1955, Mitsu and Kaze are the generational wave of the future. They personify the spirit of consumer capitalism, and their time will fully arrive in the 1960s, when 90% of the Japanese people had come to feel that they enjoyed a middle-class standard of living. In fact, during the period when Kurosawa made Ikiru, the rate of household savings was twice the pre-war rate. Thrift was a real virtue. In this respect, Mitsu and Kaze are atypical. They are ready to spend their savings and their father's. On the other hand, their desire to have their own home embodies a huge change in post-war consciousness that was underway in the early 1950s. Demand for private housing had been relatively low in the years from 1946 to 1950. The country was still terribly impoverished from the war. But the amount of Japan's gross national product allocated toward private housing then jumped by 10% in the years from 1950 to 1955, reflecting a big increase in that area of personal consumption. So Mitsu and Kaze are part of this boom, just as in other ways they anticipate the future. Kurosawa had a clear sense about where Japan was heading, and he was very ambivalent about it. On the one hand, he welcomed the freedom and democracy of the post-war years, while having tremendous misgivings about the ways an unleashed capitalism would transform the culture. So they don't understand why Watanabe didn't tell them what he wants, and in their petty selfishness, they find his behavior rude. In fact, Watanabe's going to tell almost no one that he has cancer. And in this, his behavior reflects another custom among patients of not talking about their mortal illness. It's related to the non-disclosure policy that I mentioned earlier, and it helps account for a chief difference between Ikiru and Hollywood movies about terminal disease, in which dying patients talk endlessly about their situation and their feelings. Because Watanabe says very little about any of this, the film has a terseness that enables Kurosawa to avoid the kind of melodrama that usually clings to this kind of story in the movies. This pop song emblemizes the infusion of American culture into Japan after the war, and it implicates in a distant fashion the influence of America in the growth of Japan's consumer culture. So let's just think about ourselves, stop worrying about father. Kurosawa will counterpoint the pop song from upstairs in their room with the imagery of Watanabe downstairs before his wife's shrine, giving us again the kind of powerful sound-image combination that he liked to undertake with sound designer Yanaguchi. We're going now into a montage of flashbacks that is one of Kurosawa's supreme creations as a filmmaker, and we start with the funeral of Watanabe's wife. We never do learn much about this character, but if their marriage was typical for their generation, it was a union emphasizing Watanabe's role as breadwinner and her role as mother, rather than their conjugal compatibility and intimacy. Watanabe's primary commitment was to his job. In this, the film reflects an enduring truth of marital life in Japan. Furthermore, he would have married late in life. In the 1920s and 1930s, Japanese men married in their late 20s. Thus his melancholy. A large part of his adult life was already gone when he married, and his wife is now dead. So he's lost this bulwark of self-identity, and the cancer has led him to see how empty that part of his life is where he put all of his energy, his job. More upstairs laughter, and the music underscoring Watanabe's isolation. As Kurosawa moves into and out of the past, in a series of vignettes that trace a life full of disappointments and emotional failures. His brother, for example, tells him quite accurately that if he doesn't remarry, he's going to remain alone, and Mitsu won't be very grateful to him. Notice the way Kurosawa has Watanabe positioned with his back to the camera. It's the brother who's on camera. We see him in full face, medium close-up. But Watanabe is a little bit oblique here, a little bit reclusive, taken away from us in terms of the intimacy of a gaze. Kurosawa starts to use sound to blend the time frames and mix present and past. We just heard Mitsu calling to his father inside the flashback, but really it was upstairs, in the present. Watanabe is in a deeply emotional state now. He rushes to the stairs. It seems likely that at this point he would tell Mitsu of his situation. But instead what he gets is another rebuff and disappointment. Mitsu only wants him to lock up. This is an oddly angled shot, this high angle of Watanabe on the stairs, as he slowly creeps down and goes to the front door. Kurosawa will bring in his wind track, which he uses to underscore moments of dramatic complexity. And he's going to be giving us a very fluid cut into the past now, a poetic cut cued by the bat that Watanabe will pick up and use to prop the door shut. The cut is a memory cut. The bat cues Watanabe's recollection of this day at the park where he watched his son play ball. We'll get a separate close-up of the bat, and then the associated sound of the bat hitting the ball while we stay in the present tense, and then we'll go into the past. There's our sound. And now we're in the past, and Mitsu is being a little bit too daring for his own good at the game. Watanabe is full of pride with his son, and he wants to brag on him with the guy who's sitting next to him. But Mitsu, trying to steal base, is going to be thrown out. And look at the whip pans that Kurosawa gives us as he gets caught between the first and second baseman. Kurosawa intercuts this poetic shot of Watanabe in the present with an interior voice of his son's name. His lips are not moving. Back to the game for a moment. And then he's going to give us 3 brilliantly linked shots as Watanabe sits down. We get a pan down, a boom up, and a descending elevator, blending time frames and creating a series of dislocations between Watanabe and the backgrounds. Now he fails Mitsu again. The boy is about to have an appendectomy and he's frightened. He wants his father to stay there with him at the hospital. But Watanabe, to his shame and disgrace, is going to hurry back to the office rather than stay with Mitsu. And the boy has probably never forgiven his father for this. Watanabe now has a sense, thinking back on his life, of this being a critical turning point in their relationship. In response to the lifetime of alienation between father and son that we see in the flashback, he again moves toward the stairs, his interior voice calling his son's name. But now Mitsu is off to war, a frightened boy all over again. And from the train, we see him reach out to his father once again, and probably for the last time in his life. And Watanabe is simply unable to respond. And this will cue the longest of the interior voices calling for his son as the train pulls out and the image darkens. Watanabe's melancholy cry continuing in an endless fashion. The montage has shown us a terrible accumulation of failure, disappointment, and estrangement between father and son that has robbed them of a shared past and ruptured their present. The fact that these images and memories are now flooding Watanabe's mind suggests that his knowledge of the cancer is upending his life and beginning to transform it. Certainly he's never dwelled on these things before. He's been a mummy, more dead than alive, content to stay myopically focused on his job. Now, though, he's flooded by the pain of the past and the certainty that it has ruined his present. Kurosawa has begun the process of stripping him bare, of ripping away all the external norms of support, and taking him to a place of existential isolation, where, paradoxically, his life will be transformed. We end this opening act of the film with a devastating exposure of Watanabe's perception that he's built his life on nothing. He prepares for bed. And note his method of getting the wrinkles out of his suit. This alludes to his relative poverty. It's a condition that many Japanese faced in these years after the war. He's moving slowly and stiffly, lest the torrent of grief inside him erupt uncontrollably. It's as if, were he to relax his muscle tone, then the horrible feelings that he's barely got under control, he would cease to have under control. He moves over to the bedside dresser and he's about to wind his clock. But the emotions are simply going to be too much for him. Kurosawa has got him in the shadows. This is a very dimly lit scene, and that suggests something of the emotional intimacy of the moment, at least the intimacy that we're privileged to share as the viewer of the scene. When Watanabe's grief strikes, Kurosawa is going to present it in a very discreet fashion. which is all part of the terseness of style that the film has. He scampers under the covers like a scared bunny. And as his sobbing begins, Kurosawa starts to cut away from it, first going to this low-angle shot of the commemorations on the wall, and then cutting away from Watanabe entirely to focus on the letters of commendation. Awards that meant much to him at one time in his life, but which now mean absolutely nothing. And we go out with this long fade. Kurosawa begins the second act of the film by making another leap forward in time that takes Watanabe out of the narrative, leaving his whereabouts unknown. These gaps in time, during which Watanabe briefly vanishes, prefigure his death and the radical break that occurs in the story just before that death. They suggest how deviant Watanabe has become to normal society. The brief series of scenes that we're now in shows us people searching for answers to the mystery of Watanabe's behavior. Someone from the office has inquired, he's been absent for some days, and Kaze calls Mitsu, but he too doesn't know where his father is. Back to the office and another masterful composition. Look how large that desk looms in the foreground of the shot. Kurosawa taking advantage of the perspective distortion that wide-angle lenses give us. It's so much bigger than the other characters. Suggests something of how frightened they are, how unusual Watanabe's absence is, and this disruption of routine is very upsetting to all of them. All of them at least except for Toyo. Mitsu confers with Watanabe's brother and learns that the old man has drawn on his savings. Watanabe's brother has an alternate theory about what the old man may be up to. He suggests that perhaps drawing out the money is the sign that the old man has found a mistress, and he's going to spend the money on her. And this is just fine as far as the uncle is concerned. It's relatively acceptable behavior for an elderly man in Japan to be doing this kind of thing. Watanabe's behavior in these scenes has its origin in the Tolstoy novella. Tolstoy wrote this about Ivan Ilyich's realization that he was alone with his disease. Quote, "There was no deceiving himself. Something new and dreadful was happening to him, something of such vast importance that nothing in his life could compare with it." And he alone was aware of this. Those about him either did not understand or did not wish to understand and thought that nothing in the world had changed. He saw that the people in his household, particularly his wife and daughter, who were caught up in a whirl of social activity, had no understanding of what was happening and were vexed with him for being so disconsolate and demanding. Kurosawa has transposed the ideas in this quote into his depiction of the inability of the other characters in the film to understand what Watanabe is going through, particularly the inability of his family. At last, Watanabe turns up, and this scene introduces us to the second-rate novelist who's going to be rhapsodizing about the spiritual meaning of Watanabe's illness. This black dog the writer is going to be referring to later in terms of his Mephistophelian qualities. Here's our novelist here, and we'll give him a tour of Tokyo nightlife. The splendid actor who plays this character is Yunosuke Ito, a prominent character actor in the period whom Kurosawa used in his films a few more times, most prominently as the avuncular horse-faced chamberlain in Sanjuro. The set that we see in this scene is a wonderful example of creative minimalism. Shu Matsuyama did the designs for the sets in the film, but Yoshiro Muraki constructed them and actually implemented those designs. The set here is very small, and it's dimly lit, so it doesn't reveal much to the eye, and we can't see anything of the surrounding urban area. But Kurosawa, his cinematographer Nakai, and sound designer Yanaguchi used light and sound effects to suggest the busy urban world just outside. Periodically we'll see headlights pass by, or a train will rumble past, all created abstractly as off-screen occurrences strictly through the sound and light effects. We're more than a half hour into the film, and now we get Shimura's first extended dialogue scene. We learn during the interval of time that Kurosawa has leaped over that Watanabe has gone some way toward reevaluating his life. He's dropped out of things, and he feels profoundly disillusioned with himself and the way that he's been living. He's drinking in order to cause himself more pain, as a way of punishing himself for what he now feels has been his stupidity, a way of protesting what he regards as a wasted life. Note the way that Shimura suggests a loss of physical vitality. He's hanging his head in a way that he'll be doing throughout the film, as if he can barely manage to support its weight. He moves slowly as if he's drained of energy. All of these things stand in for his physical suffering. He tells the writer that his stomach cancer is causing him great pain, but Kurosawa doesn't dwell much on this pain in the film. In fact, he glosses it a bit, in contrast to the Tolstoy novella, which goes into tremendous detail about Ivan's suffering. At the end, for example, Ivan screams continuously for 3 days, so terribly that no one can hear it without trembling. Unlike Tolstoy's character, Kurosawa allows Watanabe to change his life. Ivan Ilyich doesn't see the lie he's lived until he's at the point of dying. Only then does he realize that his family, his profession, his values were wrong. Quote, he saw clearly that all this was not the real thing, but a dreadful, enormous deception that shut out both life and death, end quote. And this truth proves to be more terrifying to him even than his pain. By then, though, he has no time to act on this knowledge. All he can do is die. Kurosawa, though, has Watanabe see all this much sooner, and if he's to act on that knowledge, he can't be as debilitated by pain as Ivan Ilyich. Thus, Kurosawa omits from the film one of the novella's most striking features, Tolstoy's merciless depictions of physical suffering. That Watanabe is afflicted with gastric cancer is significant in several ways, which make him an emblem of all Japanese. Before and after World War II, tuberculosis was the leading cause of death in Japan, a fact mirrored in several of Kurosawa's films. Drunken Angel and Scandal feature prominent characters suffering from TB. Composer Fumio Hayasaka, who scored Ikiru and was Kurosawa's close friend, would die of TB in 1955. By that time, however, TB had fallen to 5th place as a killer, and cancer had risen to 2nd. It was the most terrifying disease in Japan and became the #1 killer of adults. Of all the varieties, stomach cancer was the most common form in Japan. In fact, among developed nations, Japan has the highest rate of stomach cancer. Watanabe, then, has Japan's most emblematic post-war disorder. Japanese anxieties about cancer are inseparable from the social and historical factors surrounding World War II. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki spread fallout across Japan, as did nuclear tests by the U.S. in the Pacific and the Soviet Union in Siberia. The Japanese were eating fallout in their food and drinking it in their water. This made the anxieties about cancer in Japan enormously high in the post-war years and tied those anxieties to that period. There's an additional sense in which Watanabe's cancer is tied to the wartime situation, however. Kurosawa has already referenced the health problems in the post-war period in the mother's complaint about her child's skin rash. These health conditions, it turns out, are also relevant to Watanabe's situation. One of the causative agents involved in stomach cancer is a gastric bacterium, Helicobacter pylori, which causes a chronic inflammation and a weakened immune response, and this bacterium had been increasing in generations born since the 1920s and was found at its highest rate in those Japanese born during World War II and the early 1950s, when sanitation, housing conditions, and food availability were compromised. Obviously, Watanabe was born prior to this period, but he has the disorder that speaks to the collapse of the war years. Like the child's skin rash, Watanabe's cancer is the sign of social dysfunction, of the war's lingering results in Japan. Understood in these terms, his disease had a special salience for the period when Kurosawa made the film, as of course it still does. But there is yet another dimension to Watanabe's cancer. In the West, we speak of the heart, metaphorically, as the center of character, feeling, personality, or soul. In Japan, this region is the stomach or abdomen, which is known as Hara. Interestingly, each culture seems to have evolved pathologies to reflect these conceptions of character. A leading killer in America is heart disease. In Japan, it's stomach cancer. Hara is symbolized in a variety of ways. The samurai ritual of seppuku, or ritual suicide, involved slicing open your abdomen so that your guts would fall out. The ritual was meant to show that a warrior could take this level of pain, but more significantly, opening your abdomen meant that you were showing your true self, that you were speaking frankly. There are a host of expressions in Japanese that describe character traits in terms of the abdomen. Being frank means cutting the abdomen. Being tricky and untrustworthy means that the abdomen is black. Being evil means that it's dirty. Getting mad means the abdomen stands up. Being generous means the abdomen is big. As these ideas suggest, Hara means more than the heart does in the West. It is a seat of feeling, but also of thought, of emotion and mind. Thus, for Watanabe to be diseased here, in the Hara, means that he has an illness of heart and mind, which in the film is attributable to wrong living, wrong values, wrong thinking. These things have also caused his cancer. He can't be cured of his physical pathology. The cancer will kill him, as it did Ivan Illich. But he can alter the condition of his Hara, and specifically, he can become the sort of person described as Harage, a person of great wisdom, character, and accomplishment. The second part of the film is going to show us this. It won't be easy, and it's going to take him a long time, but here is where his redemption can be found. As always in Kurosawa's work, disease is the sign of a disturbance deep within the fiber of one's being, and also within the social order. For a Japanese viewer, Watanabe's cancer resonates with both of these dimensions of meaning, the personal and the social. And these nuances don't readily translate to a Western context, although the idea of cancer as a scourge and a destroyer certainly does. The novelist rhapsodizes at some length about Watanabe's affliction, seeing in it a sign that Watanabe is starting to live and have a lust for life. But there's an irony here. These are the ideas at the heart of the film. These are the ideas that Kurosawa believes in. But he plays a little game with us by putting them in the mouth of this secondary character who strikes us as a bit silly. Watanabe's first stop is a pachinko parlor. Pachinko was the most popular leisure activity in Japan at this time, played by millions, overwhelmingly by men, as you'll be able to see in this scene. The game was modeled on an American pinball game that was imported into Japan in the 1920s. The player buys a handful of little steel balls that you can see there, and drops them somewhat haphazardly into scoring slots that determine what, if anything, you win. The parlors were garish, noisy, neon-lit, all of which Kurosawa captures here. Interestingly, the novelist told Watanabe that the little steel ball represents his life, appropriate since a player has little control over the ball's path. Having unthinkingly done all of the expected things in his life, like getting married and working faithfully at the office, Watanabe behaved in a culturally programmed way. He probably believed all of his choices were his own, but in fact none were. Like the game, he was acted on by forces outside of his control and consciousness. Kurosawa now gives us one of his signature moving camera shots. It's the kind of tracking shot he would be very famous for, although here the camera moves a little bit more slowly than was typical of him. He's got a lot of stuff in the foreground to create a swirl of activity and a lot of clutter. And you can see how he's creating the sense of densely packed spaces. There's a very topical sense in which this nighttime sequence is working in the film. It contains a pointed social commentary. Kurosawa is showing us the explosive growth of the demimonde, the world of carnal and sensory pleasures that sprung up in Tokyo at the end of the war. And our novelist is representative of the numerous writers and intellectuals who embraced the decadence of the demimonde as a higher form of truth, counterpoised to the imperial ideology of the war years. Sakaguchi Ango, for example, published a widely noted essay in 1946 called On Decadence, in which he wrote that the war and the imperial ideology that underlay it were all illusion, and that defeat had returned to the people their rightful selves, which they could discover through the pursuit of decadence. So decadence then became a means for finding individualism in post-war Japan. Our second-rate novelist is almost certainly doing this, and he's trying to share these experiences with Watanabe so that the old man can learn at last to live as an individual. But Kurosawa is giving us a critique of this movement. In contrast to its assumptions, he's going to show us that dissipation and sensuality do not produce true individuality. Kurosawa is giving us a very striking composition here that he's going to linger on and hold for a bit. We've got the barmaid in the foreground, and the center of attention in the shot is that mirrored window behind her. Kurosawa is going to dolly forward now to take her off frame and leave her as a reflected presence there from the rear of her head between the two characters. There he goes. And now we've got a kind of prefiguration of his later widescreen filmmaking. We've got a little letterboxing effect that shows his inclination to place characters in a lateral position side by side across the frame. Now we get a real movie kind of shot, this ostentatious boom down to the dance floor as Watanabe makes his entrance. And then we're going to boom back up as we follow them up the stairs. Kurosawa is playing with one of his most elaborate sets in the film, and the boom is a way of celebrating the size of that set. Watanabe is intrigued and fascinated by what he sees here. He's never been to these kinds of places before, and it's all a little bit overwhelming. Kurosawa doesn't typically do boom shots, although there is a very exaggerated one in Drunken Angel. It works nicely here, though. It's a very sensual way of bringing us into this place, introducing a floating perspective for a floating world of pleasure. Indeed, all of the shots in this sequence have the kind of fluidity and brilliance of design that we'll see in his next film, Seven Samurai. Another example of Kurosawa's distorting perspectives to suggest that the world of the urban night is off-kilter and askew. The camera lurches back and tilts up to that mirrored area above the piano. This comic business with the dancer and the hat is going to lead us into one of the film's extraordinary and stunning scenes. The hat, in fact, is becoming one of Watanabe's emblems, and it's going to be one of the last images that we see in the film. Up till now, the hat has been part of a lot of comedy, like we see here, that makes Watanabe endearing. We see his childish attempts to hang on to it. And we laugh with him and maybe a little bit at him, as Kurosawa is taking us toward the kind of scene that he has not given us thus far, and won't give us again until the very end of the film, a scene of open, full-bodied pathos. The music here and the dancing again evokes American pop culture of the period, and suggests the kind of cultural transformations and instability that were so powerful in the period, and that Kurosawa was very attuned to as a filmmaker. Now it's time for song requests, and it's going to be Watanabe's turn to offer a request. The song that he wants the pianist to play will become his theme in the film. It's a very sweet melody, and that sweetness of melody becomes part of the beauty of the old man and conveys the sadness of his passing. Significantly, it's a song from Watanabe's youth, a ghostly trace of a life that we never get to see in the film, and we can only infer from the music. The song is called Song of the Gondola, and it was composed in 1915 by Shinpei Nakayama, with lyrics by Isamu Yoshi. The song's nostalgia for youth and the brevity of life perfectly express the sentimental feelings that now overcome Watanabe. Kurosawa gives us this striking image of the swinging beaded curtains, and then he takes us into the dance hall to a medium close-up of Watanabe, who has started to sing in a way that transfixes all of the other dancers. Note the two women dancers in the foreground there, part of the sensuality of the demi-monde. Kurosawa gives us now 3 moving camera shots that are going to prepare us for an intense close-up of Shimura's face as he sings. First, we've got a slow, circular dolly as the camera pulls back, just like the dancer is doing. Everyone senses that there's something unnerving and unearthly about this dimension of experience that the old man is in. Now we get a dolly toward the piano, which is going to continue past her and past him to the keys themselves. And now a diagonal dolly from the writer to Watanabe. 3 very fluid shots that preface the introduction of a static close-up of the old man, lingering on his face, that is going to last for 1.25 minutes, a very long time. Certainly one of the longest and the most intense close-ups in the film. This is the kind of open, direct emotional appeal that movies on this kind of subject typically traffic in. But notice that Kurosawa is only now coming to it so far into the film, and that it's only one of 2 such moments in the movie. It's the kind of scene that Takashi Shimura could do so well. He's got, as an actor, this sort of gentle simplicity and openness that Toshiro Mifune, always more guarded, more tough and macho, never had. And so Mifune was quite unsuited to this kind of a scene. By contrast, Shimura could do everything for Kurosawa. And the transformation that he would make the next year into the brave warrior of Seven Samurai is unbelievably striking after seeing him in moments like this in Ikiru. So we've got a tremendous change in the style of the film. We've been very terse and restrained for so long, and now suddenly we're in the midst of this intensely emotional scene. That's the kind of shocking transition of style that Kurosawa loved from the novels of Dostoevsky. Time now to drag Watanabe off to another way station in the night of many pleasures. And we go to sex. A huge part of the post-war demimonde was sex, and these years saw a big boom in the commercialization of sex. Strip shows were a new phenomenon, first appearing in 1948 in Asakusa, and in fact we've got an Asakusa stripper here on stage, a real one. Stripping as a stage act was a westernized form of entertainment, and it catered to the American soldiers in Japan. Tokyo's most famous sex district, in fact, Kabukicho, developed in these years in part because of its proximity to an American military base. So the stripper evokes the American presence in Japan and the wrenching cultural transformations that were underway. During the war years, the ideology of kokutai offered the ideal of a sacred national body that all were to serve. Here, though, the carnal body, the body of the flesh, has replaced the spiritual body of kokutai. The audience worships the flesh of the stripper in a way that mocks the austerity and purity of kokutai. Kurosawa, though, has our novelist character repudiate this form of entertainment, though, as you can see, Watanabe has a rather more enthusiastic response. Kurosawa now gives us his signature series of intercut tracking shots in pursuit of roaming characters whose positioning is precisely matched in each composition. He's done these kinds of shots before in No Regrets for Our Youth, and he'll do them again in Seven Samurai, Throne of Blood, Redbeard, and Rhapsody in August. And Watanabe has become a demented party animal, racing across the street, stopping traffic, and leaving the novelist, our seasoned traveler of the night, in his wake. Kurosawa's point of view in these sequences is very critical, and especially in this one, with the dance floor packed by a sea of humanity, people crowding and jostling in on one another. During the war, millions had evacuated from Tokyo because of the air raids, and in the post-war years, people flocked back to the cities. Tokyo's population, for example, jumped from 2.5 million in 1945 to more than 5 million in 1950. These brilliantly scaled shots suggest something of that explosion in the urban population and link it once again to the growth of the demimonde. Here, for example, we see an ocean of people. But poor Watanabe in this crowd is lonelier than ever, surrounded by so many people desperately seeking connection with one another and meaning from the experience. For Kurosawa, all of this is false as Watanabe's former belief that his job meant something and that he had done the right things by way of his son. All of this throbbing activity in the dance hall for Kurosawa is a way that each person has of saying, I won't die, of saying, surely these pleasures will last and not disappear. This reflective imagery on the car windows is very striking, and it's an effect that Kurosawa will do again in the pursuit scenes of High and Low. This is an interior studio set, of course, a mock-up of part of a car on which the imagery of the passing city is projected. This tight close-up of Watanabe shows that he's gone deep inside of himself. The evening has not gone as planned. The novelist is exhausted, he's increasingly anxious about his companion, and he's starting to realize that after all of the evening's pleasures, Watanabe still has his cancer. And this realization is starting to erode the novelist's confidence in the romantic blather that he was spouting earlier about Watanabe being a Christ carrying a cross called cancer. Outside the car now, we hear Kurosawa's sophisticated use of sound. Lots of ambient noises from the city and music blaring from an outdoor speaker nearby. The novelist is so drunk that he hasn't even realized that Watanabe has gotten out of the car and is even a little slow realizing that the car has stopped. He knows he's got to go retrieve his companion. When he gets out and Kurosawa cuts to the reverse angle view, coming up in just a moment, we're going to have one of the conspicuous telephoto shots in the film, one of the very few. 3 planes of space, foreground, midground, and background, flattened in the way that Kurosawa's later films of the 1950s will look. In fact, all of his later films will look that way. This extraordinary close-up, the hot light on Shimura's face, the crash and roar of the train, the trace of a smile on his mouth, and the cut back to the novelist, clutching his coat about his throat as if to keep death at bay. But he sees it now, up close and nearby, sees it on Watanabe's face, and he knows it was in the blood vomited back in the alley. All of the dancing and all of the partying won't keep it away. Kurosawa brilliantly plays this scene wordlessly. It's all done with the faces, the sound, and the editing, and it shows us again why he's so good. The novelist's dreadful epiphany back in the alley brings this chapter of the film to its close, as Kurosawa shows us again in this deep focus shot how disconnected everyone is from one another. This is the great irony of this section of the film, the desperation of the nightlife, people seeking connection and remaining apart and isolated. The prostitutes sing their trade, come on to my house. The novelist grimaces about this lesson in life that he can't glibly dismiss. And Watanabe remains alone, weighed down by an experience that has shut him out from the world of the living, and that no one else can understand. Kurosawa carries the motif of isolation into the first shot of the film's next section. Watanabe walks slowly along by himself, and Kurosawa reprises the motif of children as a crowd of them rushes past him. He takes no notice of them now, but later on children will figure decisively in his enlightenment. This close-up of the hat serves to reinforce its emblematic status as a sign of Watanabe's transition from his old life to his new one. Before, for example, he never would have been wearing such a sporty hat. Now he does. I find this an extraordinary shot transition, going from the lengthy close-up of his rigid face, staring fixedly ahead yet at nothing, to this image of Toyo bubbling with excitement, galloping toward him in the sunshine. And she's so jittery with energy that her head bobs into and out of the frame. The intercutting contrasts the two of them. She gazes at him with fixed intensity and tells him that the new hat has fooled her, calling further attention to the hat. She pulls him out of the road, and this is a favor that he's going to return in just a moment. She's decided to quit the office, and it's a decision that resonates very strongly with Watanabe. Just a short while ago, for example, he'd have found this an unthinkable thing to do. Her youthful spirit, however, inclines her differently, and Watanabe is going to find himself drawn toward that energy so intensively that Kurosawa will focus on his relationship with her in this part of the film. The actress playing Toyo is Miki Odagiri, making her first and only appearance in a Kurosawa film. It's a shame because she would have been great to see in other films. Unlike the other players, though, she didn't do very much film work at all. She's just marvelous in the role, in a performance that gives her character an appropriate complexity. And she projects such a tremendous amount of energy that she becomes precisely the kind of life force that would draw Watanabe to her in the midst of his crisis. Kurosawa sounds the theme of generational rift and misunderstanding once again, with Mitsu and Kaze squabbling about his father and mistakenly believing that it was their inquiry about his savings that produced this change in his behavior. Kaze is more insistent, Mitsu more confused and uncertain. In many of his post-war films, Kurosawa has pursued this theme of generational discontinuity and tied it to the chaos and dislocation of the war. In each case, the generation of young adults emerging from the war and participating in the economic recovery is distracted by a consumer lifestyle and becomes very acquisitive. The idea is implicit in the tense relationship in Drunken Angel between the old doctor and the young gangster. It's far more explicit in Stray Dog, when a young woman's passion for new dresses and other retail goods appalls her mother. For Kurosawa, Japan's economic recovery created an undesirable ethic of materialism, and his portrait of this becomes even more intense in some of his later films. So in the portrait of Kaze and Mitsu, we see again how topical Ikiru is, how the film is about society even as it focuses on something as personal as one man's impending death. The contrast of youth and old age fascinates Kurosawa, and this section of the film focuses on that contrast. Watanabe's life is ending, but she still has some years before her, many years in fact, and she's determined not to settle for an unfulfilling job the way that Watanabe has done. This determination impresses him, and so he talks with her in a way that he does with no one else. She's very curious about the life of this old man. She looks at those commemorations and can't believe that he spent so many years in the office. You see her counting on her fingers and frowning her head. The very thought that she might do this horrifies her. In the midst of their conversation, Watanabe will admit to her that he found the work at the office to be terribly dull. The crisis of his cancer has brought him to this point where he can acknowledge this, possibly for the first time with anyone. Take a look at the set design. We have here the relatively sparse furnishings of a traditional Japanese house, very reflective of Watanabe's generational identity and the thrift and economic constraints under which he's had to live most of his life. In the upcoming scene, the one that follows this one, we'll have a contrast with the surroundings that Mitsu and Kaze have chosen to furnish their upstairs quarters. Watanabe sinks back into his spiritual despair, and watch the way that she pulls him out of it. Her frankness and her good cheer, grabbing his hand, rescuing the old man from his depression in a way that he's going to be very dependent upon. And oops, the housekeeper comes in and mistakenly interprets that gesture. Look how crowded things are here in the set. Lots of possessions, lots of material goods, and a completely westernized look. That's a design that reflects the acquisitiveness of this young couple. In contrast to them is Toyo, who offers a more positive post-war character type. She's very assertive. She is, in fact, the only woman who works at the office with Watanabe and all of the rest of the men, and she's not at all inhibited by that. She tells jokes in front of them, for example. And her rebelliousness is quite apparent in her desire to leave that unfulfilling office. So she has imbibed the ideals of individualism and self-fulfillment that were circulating in Japan after the war, and she believes in those ideals and wants to fulfill them for herself. This assertiveness links her to the mothers, the group of women who are petitioning for the park change, and also to Watanabe, as he will be later in the film. It stands in sharp contrast with Kaze and her materialism and acquisitiveness. The tragedy of the movie, though, lies in the way that post-war Japan is not going to allow Toyo to realize her ideals. She wants a better life, but the economy is not going to grant her that opportunity. And we're going to see her essentially devolving into a proletarian, forced to work under many of the conditions that she wanted to escape. This very tightly framed shot runs for about 1.5 minutes, which is a rather long time that shows Kurosawa's preference for doing scenes in long takes. He worked this way throughout his career, increasingly so in the later films. He's got Shimura very close to the camera again, exploiting wide-angle lens capability, and Watanabe works away on her paperwork while she chatters with him about the office and expresses a level of interest in him that cannot be something that the old man has often experienced. So there's an interesting dramatic irony about this shot. While she opens herself up to him in conversation, Watanabe, in a sense, pretends not to notice, working away with fixed concentration as if he's paying little attention to her. But in fact, she's getting to him, opening up emotional needs in him that he's repressed for years. I don't mean this in any romantic way. Mitsu and Watanabe's brother are quite mistaken in this regard, as we can see. But Toyo's warmth, her energy, and her appetite for life reawakened Watanabe's need to experience something of these things. In fact, the scene has already shown us the ways in which she's affected him. He could have given her the bureaucrat's response, and he started to, telling her it's the wrong paper, but he's gone ahead and filled it out anyway. And so when he sees her torn and dirty stockings, he offers to go with her, and in fact, he's going to buy her new ones. Kurosawa ends the scene by returning to the theme of generational rift, showing Kaze and Mitsu staring dumbfounded as the old man prepares to leave the house with the young woman. They go to the window. They can't believe their father is doing what they think that he's doing. They walk out, and Toyo takes his arm, tucks in his coat, and we see the hat as an emblem again of Watanabe. We cut to a closer framing of the hat using one of Kurosawa's axial compositions, perfectly matched in terms of the camera's line of sight, and then a mischievous smile on Kaze's face, as if to say, "Mitsu, you're so dense about your father." Even the housekeeper is agitated about this change. Clearly, everyone thinks the old man's having an affair, and the housekeeper wants to know what's up. Hayasaka's wonderful musical cue conveys the childlike joyousness of this scene, where Watanabe walks with Toyo. There's not a lot of music in the film. Unlike Hollywood films of the period with wall-to-wall music, Kurosawa used music more sparingly, and so when there is a cue, it's meaningful, it really matters. I'd like to return for a moment to the detail about Toyo's torn stockings. Like the other topical references that we've been noting, this is another detail that relates to the westernization of Japan and to the difficult living conditions of the period. Little wonderful bit of business there where she gets caught between the buses. Nylons came to Japan with the Americans, along with a mystique of glamour that included brightly colored lips, nails, and clothing. All of this was enormously attractive to Japanese women, coming after the austerity and deprivation of the war years, when the government had told them that extravagance was an enemy. So Toyo was drawn to all of this, and she got herself a pair of Western nylons, which, as you can see, she's kept on wearing long past the point at which they've fallen apart. In fact, if you look generally at her clothing, you can see that it's all rather worn and a little threadbare. So is Watanabe's coat and the suit that he's been wearing, which is probably the only one that he owns. Of all Japan's industries, textiles had been hit especially hard by the war, with manufacturing for the domestic market cut back in favor of weapons production. So clothing was very scarce, and when it was available, it was hard for a lot of people to buy. Inflation had exploded in the years after the war. Wholesale prices were hundreds of times higher at the time this movie was made than they were before the war. Toyo now starts consuming an incredible amount of food, not just in this scene, but in the ones that follow. It's one of the signs of her life force in the movie, but if you watch these scenes carefully, it becomes quite an impressive feat of endurance. It's clearly beyond Watanabe's capability. This marvelous scene in the tea house is another of Kurosawa's deep focus long takes, and this one runs about 2 minutes. He used these long takes because he thought that the actors gave better performances by remaining in character over a more extended time than they can do when each shot is much quicker. Beginning with Seven Samurai, his next picture, he started filming with multiple cameras in order to do a scene essentially in a single take, but covered it from a variety of angles that let him edit freely among them, while preserving for the actors the experience of performing in an extended block of time. I think you see the results of this method here. The interplay between Toyo and Watanabe as she happily confides in him all of her pet names for people at the office seems very real and unforced. The laughter between them seems quite genuine. We can see the emotions between them in real time. And Kurosawa respects that so much that when she rather reluctantly confesses her name for him, the mummy, Kurosawa has Watanabe drop that spoon as the sign of his agitation. He doesn't do the thing that most directors would do, cut to a close-up of Watanabe's reaction. He stays inside this two-shot because it's the relationship between them that's important, not either separately from the other. And so it's the business with the spoon that tells us about the intensity of Watanabe's reaction. Toyo's jokes are a kind of rebellion. They're a way of protesting the deadening routine of the office, and gradually they thaw him out. We go out of the scene with this delightful bit of business, Watanabe laughing for the only time in the film. A wipe takes us to the street outside, and Toyo makes an effort to end the day, but Watanabe he needs more from her. And so he invites her to spend the day with him, keep him company, and the first place that he takes her is to the Pachinko parlor, as if to say, I'm not the kind of guy that maybe you thought I was. It turns out he did take something away from that night with the novelist after all, and now here he is, using this new social skill. Her responses are childlike in their exuberance and enthusiasm. This, of course, is one of the things that draws Watanabe to her, but it's significant in another way, too. For Kurosawa, children are emblematic kinds of characters. In his films, their innocence shows how the world could be if only it weren't so corrupted and evil. And the suffering of children and the young indicts the condition of humanity and exposes its injustices. Kurosawa possibly derived this outlook from the novels of Dostoevsky, who was his favorite author, but at the same time in his own life he was very disturbed by incidents that involved cruelty toward children, so that when he encountered this sensibility in the pages of Dostoevsky, he doubtlessly recognized a kindred spirit. And so in Rashomon and many of his other films, we see that efforts to save children become an essential condition of heroism. And Toyo just never flags in terms of her energy. Watanabe has had enough, but Toyo is still hungry for new experiences. It's important to note this because it will contrast with her as we see her later in the film when she does find a new job. She's not going to be showing this level of spirit and energy. Among all of Kurosawa's films, Ikiru is one of the supreme statements of the idea that children and vulnerable members of society need protection. Children are going to be the focus of Watanabe's energies in the last weeks of his life. So Toyo's openness and enthusiasm place her in this category of characters who show the injustice of the world. And as I've noted, we've yet to see the real impact of that injustice upon her, but Kurosawa is going to show it to us in later scenes. So she's important for Watanabe in many ways. Chief among them is the way that her openness to experience draws him out, thaws out his husk of a personality, and inspires his determination to make things better for others. This is one of many compositions in the film where Watanabe hangs his head in the foreground of the frame. We'll see a lot of this in the office scenes later on in the movie. But now he's spoiling their fun by speaking in a way that isn't genuine. He's going to tell Toyo that everything he did was for his son, that he became a lifeless mummy all for Mitsu. It's a way of denying his own responsibility, his own ability to make choices. At some level, of course, he believes this, but as long as he clings to this idea, he will never find enlightenment. The camera now does a slow pull back, It's going to open up some space to enable Toyo to stretch out. But at the same time, it's as if the camera is recoiling from Watanabe's lack of honesty, his self-deception. We're now at the end of a very busy day for Watanabe, and also one of the relatively rare sections of the film in which Kurosawa gives us a diverse view of Tokyo locations. We've seen a movie house, we've seen an amusement park, a skating rink. Ikiru has a very inward quality to it, in part because the locations in the film are rather restrictive. This is very much in contrast to a previous film of Kurosawa's, Stray Dog, in 1949, where he's filming all over downtown Tokyo, showing us an incredible array of places. He doesn't do that as much here in Ikiru. A lot of the film is concentrated in the offices, for example. But the signs of post-war change are here nevertheless. We see them in the locations and in the behavior of the characters. They're a bit more implicit in Ikiru than they've been in the earlier films, but they are there nonetheless. Here is my favorite moment in the film. She asks, "Why do you speak badly about your son? You love him." And she smiles. Her burst of goodwill, Watanabe's smile, slowly comes out. The reprise of Hayasaka's memory theme. And now my favorite shot in the whole film. Watanabe hurrying home, burdened with the knowledge of his impending death. He's all alone on the streets of Tokyo at night, in a state that no one can understand. And yet he can't wait to talk to his son. After all these years, he's found this new determination to be honest with Mitsu and talk about what's happening to him. And the outcome of this effort is a painful scene of blocked emotion and failure to understand. A scene that is terribly consistent with the history of Watanabe and Mitsu's relationship as we've seen it in the flashback montage. And I think here we have to acknowledge the sobering honesty of the film. Family patterns are very difficult to change, especially patterns of communication that have become ingrained over the years. It would be so much easier for Kurosawa to give us a warm emotional bath by having a breakthrough of communication occur. That would make for a lesser film. It's more honest, though, if more sobering, to keep us locked into this failed family dynamic, despite Watanabe's efforts to overcome it. So the camera pulls back and shows us this tense domestic tableau, with Kaze and Mitsu pretending to be busy, but actually waiting for and dreading whatever bombshell they're expecting the old man to drop. They believe it will be more foolishness over his mistress. So Kurosawa is ruthless, then, in showing the dead end that family life has become for Watanabe, and the special kind of emptiness that he feels in this household, and the way that that hand trembles as he sets the cup down and the sound effects catch his anxiety. In a great many of Kurosawa's films, the family as an institution is cold and oppressive, filled with its own special kinds of cruelties. Kurosawa is not a director like Ozu who celebrates family life. Just think of Ran, for example, that epic film about familial betrayal. This makes him somewhat atypical in a Japanese context. Instead of affiliating with the typical sources of personal identity, such as family, nation, and work, Kurosawa's characters break with these things to find values that will give their lives meaning. And the values can't be found within conventional society, because for Kurosawa, it's corrupt and without humanity. So his heroes have to rebel. And what he's showing us in this section of Ikiru is Watanabe's painful realization that everything he's built his life on is wrong, and he can't find meaning in those things. Kurosawa is stripping Watanabe bare. He's tearing everything away from him, taking him to a 0 point of absolute negation. And Hayasaka hits us with this musical cue, harsh, aggressive, that conveys the emotional violence of the scene. This process of reduction that Kurosawa is taking Watanabe through is one that numerous philosophers have stressed in their discussions of the way that death transfigures its beholder. Paul Tillich wrote, for example, that anxiety is the self-awareness of the finite self as finite. Ernest Becker wrote that facing the terror of existence, the self must be destroyed, brought down to nothing, in order for self-transcendence to begin. Soren Kierkegaard wrote that the self must be broken in order to become a self, and that he who is educated by dread is educated by possibility. This precisely is what Kurosawa is showing us. Watanabe disappears again from the narrative, and the dispassionate narrator has stepped in to fill the void. We see the effect his absence has on his co-workers. It creates a kind of black hole in their understanding and routine, something they can't perceive the reasons for or even begin to understand. And so they spread a lot of rumors about what might possibly be going on. Watanabe is a cipher to them, a phenomenon that Kurosawa is going to be exploring at length in the second part of the film. We've got two of the Kurosawa regulars on screen here. This is Kamatari Fujiwara, second from the left, and Bokuzen Hidari in the glasses just to his right. These are regular character actors that appear in a good many of Kurosawa's films. I love the vibrating glass in these windows. It creates an undercurrent of tension in the scene that is very appropriate for this confrontation. Toyo feels uneasy that the old man is looking for something from her that she can't possibly provide, possibly cannot understand. Despite her warmth and good cheer, she is, after all, limited in her understanding, and Watanabe has to learn the lesson that this section of the film is suggesting, that living vicariously through another person, or for them, is no good. In the end, one is still alone. Love is not enough. This scene and the next one give us a new perspective on Toyo, a social perspective in which Kurosawa suggests the way that material circumstance is bearing down on her. She's a factory worker. She's stressed out. She's on the clock with her job performance measured by production output. And so her anger is coming from all of these pressures as well as Watanabe. And as she says, she's too exhausted now to go out and do anything but sleep. Watanabe walks through this array of white rabbits, and they're going to play a big role in the next scene. Her future then seems relatively bleak. She wanted to find a rewarding and challenging job, something other than the office, but now she's got one that exhausts her and has drained her spirits. Her future, though, is not the future of all young people in Japan. One of the marvelous things about Kurosawa's work, especially in this period, is his sensitivity to class, to social stratification. As in societies everywhere, not everyone suffers equally. Take a look at this well-dressed young couple in the foreground and those happy school children in the background across the room on the other side of that window. These are characters who are cushioned by wealth and privilege. For them, the post-war years are not as burdensome as they are for Toyo. And we're meeting representatives of the better-off classes in this scene of the film. Toyo gazes longingly at them. The layout of the set gives us a splendid metaphor for class and social division. Poor Toyo is never going to be one of those kids. They inhabit a different universe from the one that she lives in. They're not oppressed by work. They've got nice clothes. They're carefree. And Kurosawa shows us these class differences by placing those characters across the room from Toyo, distanced from her, separated by the staircase and the wall of windows. This kind of privilege isn't a reality in her life. Those children are there, visible in the distance, as a reminder that the comfortable life is available only to some. And so the question that runs through these compositions that Kurosawa wants to suggest is this right? Toyo presses Watanabe now for an answer as to why he wants to be with her. And her insistence that he give her one prods him to search deeply inside himself. He pauses. He's not quite sure himself why he wants to be with her, and at first he offers a few relatively superficial explanations. As we'll see, though, in a moment his thoughts and feelings are going to gush out in an unexpected way. The scene is going to give us a very frank depiction of his psychological and emotional state. It's one of the few such frank depictions that we have in the movie. And so it's one of the most important passages in the film, where Kurosawa is going to show us in the most moving terms the terrible fear and loneliness of the old man. And at the same time, where Kurosawa is going to reveal the philosophy of existence, which is at the heart of the film. Before Watanabe can speak, though, he's got to go into another one of those extended moments where it's as if he becomes disassociated from his surroundings. It's almost a fugue-like state where he gives us the look, this intense look of self-absorption and almost obsession. It's a look that unnerves the other characters in the film. It does to Toyo a little bit here, and it's going to do so more explicitly later in the scene. As if cued by the music, the wonderful March of the Wooden Soldiers, Watanabe now pours out his heart. He tells her that he's got gastric cancer. It's one of only 2 characters in the film that he says this to, and significantly neither of which is any member of his close family. When he tries to find a metaphor to explain to her what this experience must be like, he draws on an event from his past, an episode when he nearly drowned. And this gives us one sign of how personal this material is for Kurosawa. He's using his own life experience as a basis for Watanabe. The old man's reference to nearly drowning comes from Kurosawa's own life. He nearly drowned as a boy, and just as he has Watanabe describe, Kurosawa recollected that at the time his parents and everyone else seemed far away. He was isolated and alone in his crisis. This experience said something fundamental about life for Kurosawa, and he gives that lesson here to Watanabe. Namely, it's the idea that we are all alone. The old man knows this now, and the power of the movie lies in its unsentimental emphasis on that fact, and its terrifying implications. As Dostoevsky's novels asked, if we are all alone and there is no God, then all is permitted, every cruelty imaginable. But here is where the philosophical power of the film merges with its moral beauty. Kurosawa shows us the bleakness of being alone in the world, shows it to be a fundamental truth of the human condition, but then he finds it to be an insufficient truth. Watanabe cannot exist in this void. He must have meaning, as must we all, and the film's tremendous beauty lies in Kurosawa's showing how he finds it by connecting to other people, moving radically and paradoxically from nothingness to an all-consuming devotion to others. So Watanabe grasps for meaning. Why does he want Toyo? Well, maybe it's because she's kind to him. Maybe it's because she has this incredible energy. Perhaps it's because she's so young. He crosses to her, and we have another of those moments in the film where Watanabe's intensity unhinges those around him. Toyo is afraid of him. He's wild and unpredictable, and he's in some dimension of experience that she can't grasp. He begs her to teach him how to be like her, full of energy. He's got to live this way before he dies. But this, too, is a dead end. Kurosawa insists that wisdom has to come from within each person. Kurosawa was not a Buddhist, but there are overtones of this outlook in his work, particularly his insistence on the radical break with ordinary experience that true enlightenment produces. All of his heroes are enlightened individuals who therefore lead unconventional lives, but only in a few films did Kurosawa show us the experience of enlightenment as it happens, and Ikiru is the one that gives us the most beautiful and intense such depiction. Toyo runs that silly white rabbit under Watanabe's nose, and I find this an incredibly powerful moment because of the contrast between the ridiculousness of that child's toy and the depth of Watanabe's despair and depression. Kurosawa is going to show us in just a moment the flash of insight that transforms Watanabe's life. And he's going to show it as a moment of satori, which in Zen Buddhism is a flash of instantaneous awakening to the heart of things, where one sees deeply into the meaning of existence, where all becomes clear. And for Watanabe, it's going to transfigure everything. First, though, he's got to sink to his point of deepest unhappiness, convinced that nothing good can come of the bureaucracy, and there will be no possible way of using his job productively. We get an incredibly tight close-up on Shimura's face, one of the tightest in the film, as his eyes well with tears. And Toyo freaks out a little bit because she can't understand what's happening with this old man. Now, though, Watanabe has grasped it. His flash of insight has occurred, and he knows that he can make a difference. It's not too late. So characteristically, he grabs that rabbit, which is the emblem that triggered his inspiration, and he rushes off. And sometimes in film you don't want things to be too subtle. We have old age going down the stairs, passed by youth coming up, and the school children serenade their new arrival with "Happy Birthday to You," but we of course know that the song is really meant for Watanabe. Kurosawa doesn't go out of the scene just yet. He hangs for a moment on Toyo and allows us to see once again the class divisions that separate her life from those of the better off in post-war Japan. Then the fade comes. In a brief coda to the film's first section, we're going to find Watanabe at the office where he's putting his newfound enlightenment into action. These codas are a structural device that Kurosawa loved to include in his movies, and they're one sign of just how carefully designed his work was. The hat again as emblem. Ono, his subsection chief, sees this new hat and knows that it bodes nothing good, that Watanabe is back now to upset the office routine. Again, you see how Kurosawa uses space remarkably in the film, using objects in the office to break up the area and separate characters. This stack of papers is nearly as tall as Shimura is when filmed from this low-angle camera position. Watanabe is searching for the drainage reclamation petition, and everyone watches him with tremendous anxiety because they fear that after all of this time they may actually have to do some work. Kurosawa had a wonderful grasp of camera movement and its metaphorical possibilities. As Fujiwara and his underling approach the desk, we go to this framing, which places them on either side of Watanabe. They act as a kind of frame within a frame, entrapping him in a small space in the center there. But as Watanabe tells them what he wants them to do, act on this petition, Kurosawa is going to dolly his camera forward, and he's going to reprise the Happy Birthday theme. Here we go. And now they move off the edge of the frame, which allows Watanabe to dominate the frame now with considerable presence. It's a visual way of talking about the new kind of moral authority that he now possesses. As Watanabe hurries them along, he goes out proclaiming the great theme at the heart of Kurosawa's philosophy of life. Namely, that willpower and determination can conquer all human problems. This, in fact, is the last that we will see of Watanabe alive. With this inspiring declaration of principle, the old man exits from the film, and Kurosawa marks his passage with a siren, wailing as Watanabe hurries out the door, off frame, out of the present tense of the story, and out of life itself. The story abruptly breaks now as the narrator emotionally tells us that Watanabe has died, and we have a series of axial compositions of his funeral portrait, moving progressively back in a series of shots lined up precisely along the camera's line of sight established in the first composition. The honking horns outside signal the arrival of a group of reporters. This group of reporters is a kind of recurring character group in Kurosawa's modern-day films. It serves as a sort of chorus in story situations where Kurosawa is talking about the wall between officials and the people. Kurosawa uses these reporters again in The Bad Sleep Well and High and Low, all films which talk about this quality of political life in Japan, of walling itself off from the popular will, and suggesting implicitly that there's a kind of anti-democratic component to this. Nobuyo Nakamura, as the deputy mayor, is going to have to go out and talk to them. We've jumped over a lot of story information here. It's not just the fact that Watanabe has died and we've moved forward in time, but through the questions that the reporters will be asking, we're going to learn that there's been a park that's been built, that the deputy mayor and his men have taken credit for that park. Furthermore, that Watanabe has died there and that the women of the area believe that there's been a kind of conspiracy. that the conspiracy was to take the credit for making the park, to discredit Watanabe by doing that, and therefore that his death in the park was in fact a kind of suicide, an act of protest. If you look just to the left of Nobuo Nakamura, you'll see Kamatari Fujiwara playing the subsection chief who will become the new Watanabe, who will get Watanabe's post now that the old man is gone. Fujiwara is one of the great character actors in Kurosawa's films, a tremendously skilled performer that Kurosawa loved to employ. In fact, he appears in all but 2 of the movies from this one until Kagemusha in 1980. He even appears in Horse, a picture Kurosawa co-directed in 1941 under his mentor Kajiro Yamamoto. In terms of Fujiwara's amazing range, his performances include the paranoid farmer Manzo in Seven Samurai, the bloodthirsty merchant Tazemon in Yojimbo, the dying Rokosuke in Redbeard, and an old man in Dodeskuden. But his best roles are the tragic alcoholic actor in The Lower Depths, and a supremely comic performance as Matakishi, the peasant in Hidden Fortress. Fujiwara's skill in this film is apparent in the way that he becomes a kind of faceless executive, a subliminal part of the ensemble of players who fill out the bureaucracy. The narrative has broken into its second extended act just at that point where every other director would believe he had the climax, Watanabe's efforts to build the park, and would use it to create the greatest amount of melodrama and pathos. But notice that it's just there that Kurosawa takes Watanabe away from us. From now on, we're going to be seeing the reactions of his family and co-workers and their recollection of the old man's last days. Breaking the story in half like this was screenwriter Hideo Oguni's great contribution. Oguni became one of Kurosawa's regular screenwriters, working on most of his pictures up through Ran in 1985. Ikiru, though, was his first film for Kurosawa, although they had known each other for years because Oguni also worked at Toho, Kurosawa's studio, and had even written some pictures for Kurosawa's mentor, Kajiro Yamamoto. Kurosawa came to rely on Oguni's keen judgments about story structure, and Oguni's great contribution to Kurosawa's work was his refusal of sentimentality. And this, in fact, is why Kurosawa liked to write with a group of 2 or 3 other screenwriters. Each could come up with a better idea than the others. It was a kind of informal competition among them, and each would correct the other's weaknesses. Kurosawa, for example, was a very sentimental filmmaker, which sometimes got out of hand in pictures like One Wonderful Sunday and The Bad Sleep Well. By contrast, Ikiru was extremely tough-minded, and Oguni kept refusing to take things toward false sentiment. So breaking the narrative into 2 sections became a very important way of controlling the emotions of the film. It distances us from what happens, just as the narrator does. Furthermore, it enables the film to develop multidimensional perspectives on what happens. Kurosawa had wanted to tell the story in a linear, straightforward way, and early script drafts were like that. But Oguni insisted that Watanabe had to die midway through. Kurosawa initially resisted this idea, but then he welcomed it. He had, after all, already shown an aptitude for unconventional storytelling techniques, experimenting with multiple flashbacks and their conflicting points of view in Rashomon. And he became quite fond of breaking a film into 2 halves with contrasting styles and themes. Ikiru is his first such picture, but he goes on to do it again in High and Low, Redbeard, and Dersu Uzala. So Oguni's idea proved to have a very long legacy in Kurosawa's work. To some extent, this design is implicit in Tolstoy's novella, which opens with Ivan's friends receiving news of his death and then going into a flashback showing his last days. But the narrative design is much more complex in Ikiru. The 2 sections of the film show us very different things. In the first section, we bear witness to Watanabe's tormented search for meaning and see him stripped bare of all the norms of identity. This section, therefore, is very personal and psychological in its focus. But the second section, the one we're in now, by contrast focuses on society through its representatives in the family and the bureaucracy, And it's going to show us the utter inability of everyone around Watanabe to truly comprehend what he has done and why. So the focus now is no longer on the individual, and that's why Kurosawa has taken Watanabe away from us. We get instead a profoundly pessimistic depiction of the failure of society to nurture the kind of values that Watanabe acts on in his last days. So the interplay of the two sections allows Kurosawa to show us the relation of the individual to society, a relation of tension, and to say that while in Japan the social norm typically prevails, it's the kind of heroism that Kurosawa endorses which requires a more radical break with tradition. In this section of the film, we're going to see the terrible triumph of society, of things as they are. And yet, inside those flashbacks of Watanabe defying the bureaucracy, the flashbacks that are coming up, working on his park project, we're going to get a glimpse of alternative values, ones that flare into a brief existence, whose example condemns the world as Kurosawa shows it here, and suggests the possibility of a future that can transform the past and the present and their pathologies. In his films of the post-war period, Kurosawa has been dramatizing this radical break with the past and predicating heroism upon it. And the movies from this period show us what he felt had to occur if Japan were to recover from the war. But Ikiru is the last such film from that period when renewal and democratization were real hopes and ideals. His pessimism now has grown much stronger, and we're going to get the bleakest depiction of society that we have yet seen in a Kurosawa film. The appearance of the mothers, with their genuine grief, punctures the all-too-false sentimentality and pomposity of the bureaucrats and their glad-handing ways. And Kurosawa goes into this extended moment where he contrasts the weeping of the mothers with the puzzled, embarrassed reactions of the officials and the confusion of Mitsu and Kaze, who have no idea who these people are and what Watanabe's connection was with them. The actress who's placing this paper on the shrine is Eiko Miyoshi, one of Kurosawa's regular players that he'd often cast as grandmothers or mothers. The framing of these faces is extremely tight. It puts us inside the moment, into close proximity to these characters, and the editing shows us why Kurosawa was so brilliant. He does the kind of counterpoint between picture and sound that he and Yanaguchi were so fond of, letting the weeping go on and on, often off-screen, while the camera gives us the faces of Mitsu, Kaze, and the officials, all of whom are very far from feeling this kind of open, unrestrained grief. The genuineness of the mothers, played mostly through sound, exposes the emptiness, the artificiality, the lie of the funeral ceremony and its manufactured version of reality. In building this counterpoint of picture and sound, Kurosawa is practicing what Eisenstein called intellectual montage, where the editing aims to suggest an idea to the viewer, above and beyond the usual functions that editing plays of telling a story. For Eisenstein, this was a special category of editing, and Kurosawa, influenced in a number of ways by Eisenstein's work, shows how well he understood it. He shifts into this mode of editing so fluidly and gracefully that the viewer suddenly realizes that the rhetorical inflection of the scene has changed without having noticed the transition itself. We've got now an unusual 4-shot axial series, closing in on a close view of Watanabe's portrait. And this reminds us of our hero, and it raises a question to the first-time viewer of the film, namely, are we going to get to see him again? Kurosawa gets out of the rhetorical mode that he was in when the mothers leave, and the rather stunned bureaucrats have to respond to what has been implicitly a class-based challenge to their authority, their ability to command the official version of events. These relatively impoverished women, living in a poor section of town, know very well who did what on the park, and they view Watanabe's death as a form of public protest against the officials. So there is that question in the narrative that Kurosawa has planted. Did, in fact, Watanabe die in a way that would be a form of protest? The bureaucrats can say what they will, but the honest, open grief of the women give the lie to their claims. Their presence at the funeral enables Kurosawa to show again what he showed earlier in the scene with Toyo and the celebrating schoolchildren: social inequality and class disparity. The mother's presence shows us the same thing that the flashbacks of Watanabe will do: an alternative reality to the social corruption that is dominant, one that is based on genuine caring and charity toward others. The real tragedy of this film is that these alternatives can exist only as quick flashes, brief glimpses of possibility, and then they're gone. As the top officials leave, we have a wipe, and Kurosawa goes into a medium long shot that emphasizes the stiff formality of the setting, everyone lined up side by side, and suggests that there's a correlation between this formality and the bad faith of everyone present, their suppression of the truth, or their willful inability to understand. Later on, as the scene continues and everyone gets a little bit drunk and start to reminisce about Watanabe, Kurosawa's camera moves and blocking of the action will become a little more free-flowing, disrupting the formality to suggest the way that the truth breaks in upon all of them, as they slowly come to entertain the idea that maybe Watanabe really did it. This official in the very background of the shot is Kimura, the one who's talking now. In some ways, he is going to be the conscience of this section of the film. He knows the truth, alone among all of them. He's the quickest to see it, and as we will see, he will be the most terribly burdened by that knowledge. There are a number of Kurosawa's regular players in the film, and we're going to get to see a bit more of them in these scenes. The bumpkin in the glasses here, who is going to happily proclaim that the park really just happened, is Minoru Chiaki, who first appeared in Stray Dog, and who will be one of the 7 samurai, Heihachi, the good-natured and humorous one. Chiaki's other notable appearances include Throne of Blood, where he plays the samurai Miki, and The Hidden Fortress, in which he gives a splendid comic performance as the peasant Tahei. This actor speaking now, and who we see here, is Bokozen Hidari, making only his second appearance in a Kurosawa film, and he'll be an indelible part of the Kurosawa company. He's got a face you never forget, and he's got a very distinctive voice. Hidari was a natural comic, and Kurosawa used him that way in Seven Samurai, where he plays the wimpish farmer Yohei. We're seeing again here the particularly Japanese context that surrounds cancer. Asked if his father knew that he was dying, Mitsu says no, he was lucky not to know. As I mentioned before, doctors and patients alike agreed that the victim would be healthier for not knowing. All of the characters in this section of the film accept that as a fundamental principle. This is an important point to grasp because it helps account for one of the features of Ikiru that might seem odd, tendentious, or overly elaborated to a Western viewer. And that's the question of why Watanabe's co-workers take so long to realize that indeed the old clerk did know. As Kurosawa moves into the flashbacks, the bureaucrats are going to be slowly circling around this question and will have tremendous difficulty at first even formulating it and then accepting the answer. A Western viewer might wonder why they don't see it sooner and then move on. But the Western viewer proceeds from very different medical traditions, in which an informed patient is considered paramount. In Japan in the 1950s, cancer was viewed as a death sentence, the knowledge of which would incapacitate the victim and render them unable to work or otherwise function. So how could Watanabe know and continue to work? Kurosawa gives us a splendid image of Watanabe's defiance and iron will. From these lovely telephoto shots of the group in the rain, he steps forward into the fetid waters of the drainage pond. One of the mothers offers him shelter, as Kurosawa again suggests that it's the class basis to the alliance between them that helps to make it so progressive. This actress with the umbrella is Kintsugai, who appears in some small roles in other Kurosawa films, including the mother of the crazy boy in Dodes'ka-den. The efforts of the Allied powers occupying Japan to promote democracy focused on several types of reforms, and these included breaking up monopolies in steel, mining, and other heavy industries, and land reform encouraging a shift away from tenant farming. Reforms focusing on labor and civil service aimed to do away with so-called feudalistic behavior. This was a vague term, but it generally referred to situations where behavior between superior and subordinate was coded and founded on unquestioning obedience and loyalty. The Allies felt that such attitudes had been a part of Japan's war effort. In these sections of the film, Kurosawa shows us exactly what the Allies had aimed to root out. The bureaucracy is based on norms of obedience, obligation, and loyalty that drive out individual initiative. The movie is a savage critique of these aspects of Japanese society, but it's also a very topical critique of the Allied reforms that chastises them for being such failures. In this respect, we can see that Kurosawa is getting away with a little bit in terms of the film's fortuitous timing. From 1947 to 1952, the Allies subjected Japanese movies to film censorship. They looked at the scripts in pre-production and then screened the films once they were finished to root out troublesome areas of content. One such area would have been anything critical of the Allied occupation reforms. The fact that this program of censorship ended midway through the production of Ikiru helps us to understand some of the critical content that Kurosawa was able to get into the movie.
しかしですね、結局ですね、公園課長も渡辺さんのあの不思議な粘りには。そういえばそうですね。いや、あれにはうちの課長も参っておりましたよ。
This is a splendid composition with Watanabe bisecting the deep focus frame, and it shows us how brilliantly the old clerk is playing the system. He's subverting it by playing by its own rules, becoming super subservient, ultra polite, hyper deferential in ways that just drive everybody bananas. And we've seen this pose before. Watanabe in the foreground, he's in profile, he's immobile, his head is bowed. It's his signature stance. Previously, though, it connoted resignation and despair. Now it signals his determination and his patience. This shot runs a full minute in which nothing apparently happens, but everything does. It tells us exactly how Watanabe is going to prevail. He's going to become an immovable object to the system. And Kurosawa knows that for the viewer to feel this, the shot has to have duration. It's got to go on for some length so that we can feel Watanabe's obstinacy in both space and time.
とにかく首を縦に振るまでは何日でも。いや一時うちの課長など渡辺さんの顔を見るとこそこそ逃げ回ってね。そうだってね。
We get now a quick series of glimpses of the interaction of Watanabe with his co-workers. In one, we see them run away from the old guy as he comes down the hall because he's bringing them nothing but trouble. In the next glimpse from the past that we'll have, Watanabe is bowing to everyone. The bow in traditional Japanese society is an acknowledgement of social ties and interpersonal obligations. And Watanabe taking it to this extreme is a kind of subversive gesture. He's using the ritual, but in a sense he's emptying it out of its traditional meaning. And he can't leave until he's acknowledged everyone's presence. This is Minoru Chiaki again, the great Kurosawa regular. There's always a slightly comic undercurrent to his performances in Kurosawa's pictures. And now they begin to think of all the really extraordinary things that involved Watanabe at the end of his life. And we're going to go in now to one of the loveliest images in the film, about the mutual devotion to one another's welfare at the heart of the movie and Kurosawa's ethical vision of the just world. the mothers have adopted Watanabe as one of their own, and they are as devoted to him and protective as he is to them and their project. Kurosawa shows us something here that he would propose again more radically in Redbeard, that acts of charity and goodwill can inspire the same thing in others, and that if this falls somewhat short of changing the world, it is nevertheless a force to conjure with. Take a look at that spot on the wall right there in the background. It looks as if there's some fire damage in that part of the wall. If so, it's a lingering sign of the war's devastation and of the slow pace of recovery. It's exactly the kind of topical information that Kurosawa would build into his set design. In the feudalistic behaviors of the bureaucracy, knocking on the deputy mayor's door is unthinkable, especially accompanied by all that riffraff from the tenement. But now they realize that what happened in the office was even odder. Kurosawa reminds us again of the inequities of class, the unequal distribution of privilege. While the tenement dwellers wait outside, the mayor is going to be prattling on about his evening with geisha. These would not necessarily be prostitutes, but rather companionable women that a man of privilege might spend an evening with. And the mayor jokes that one was evidently a student seeking to better her lot, which to him is contemptuous. And they all laugh rather contemptuously of this. Now watch his reaction when Watanabe asks him to reconsider. It's just unthinkable. He gives the deputy mayor the Watanabe look, the one that upsets everybody when they receive it. And there's poor Fujiwara behind Watanabe, frantically pulling on his arm to get them out of this embarrassing and rude moment. But the old clerk just won't move. He is an immovable object for the system, and they're going to act on his request ultimately simply as a way of getting him to hurry along. I said before that there's a lot of mystery that surrounds Watanabe, and a lot of these scenes are very oblique. We see the requests being made, but we actually never see any of the actual work that was involved in getting the park built. We don't see any of those moments where Watanabe's superiors say yes and accept his requests, knuckle under to his strange persistence. All of that remains off frame. Everybody is a bit looser now when we come back out of the flashback. These funeral wakes were notorious for turning into long drinking sessions. And part of the sociology of being a male executive or a male bureaucrat in Japan would involve heavy use of liquor where you're drinking with your buddies. And everybody becomes a bit more loosened up, and gradually as this happens, the truth comes out. And all of these guys come to see their own lives in ways that, when sober, they wouldn't permit themselves to grasp. Here's another example of Kurosawa's strange ironies. If Watanabe's zeal can't be understood, then the world is dark indeed. That's very true. That idea is very much at the heart of the film. And it's a very didactic quality that Kurosawa has in his work, where he will proclaim these ideas outright. That quality became much stronger in his later work, but you can see it here surfacing in moments like this. We go now into one of the most affecting flashbacks of the movie. This shot of the old man staggering down the hall is one of the few moments in the film that alludes to his physical pain and fatigue. As I mentioned earlier, Kurosawa largely glosses over these. He doesn't ignore them completely, but he doesn't put them on center stage either. These sets that Shu Matsuyama designed give us another good illustration of Kurosawa's social realism to show the conditions of time and place in these post-war years. As you see the office in these flashbacks, look at how grubby the sets are, how splotched with grime and dirt, in yet another of the film's allusions to poor living conditions. The late 1940s and early 1950s in world cinema were the era of Italian neorealism, and Kurosawa's movies of that time have a similar spirit. He doesn't strip cinema technique down to a bare minimum the way the neorealists did, but like them, he does want to show the realities of how people lived inside a moment of history. So you watch his movies from 1946 to 1951, and you come away with a very strong sense of how things were in that period. Now, these exteriors at the park give us the kind of telephoto shots that we associate with the later films of Kurosawa. This action where Watanabe falls and the mothers rush to him shows why Kurosawa loved telephoto lenses. It's the way they transform movement by heightening and abstracting it. In this regard, it's significant that he's done so much of the film until now in wide-angle deep focus, but here he goes to long focal lengths because he's got action and some movement. For Kurosawa, there was a fundamental connection between stylizing movement and shooting telephoto. I love this shot of Shimura's face. The movie is so full of lovely moments, and this is one of the most beautiful. The hot light on his face conveying not just his happiness, but the flaring of an inner spirit in defiance of the cancer that is eating away at him. And he gazes out at the coming into being of something that he loves, this park. See how hot that light becomes. Indeed, his face was glowing, like a grandfather looking at a grandchild. We're prepping now for one of the most interesting of the flashbacks, and one of the most oblique, where Kurosawa introduces a complication into the story that he doesn't ever fully explain or resolve. And that complication involves the efforts of local gangsters, local yakuza, to claim the land for themselves. If you think about it, the efforts of the yakuza to take control of that land and block Watanabe's efforts with the park, because they want to build a tavern there, should have been successful. These gangsters are powerful. The politicians would have been responsive to them. So why did they fail? Why wasn't the tavern built? Why wasn't Watanabe's effort blocked? That's an interesting question, and I'll suggest an answer to that toward the end of this flashback. This is a scene where we get a couple other of the seven samurai. The gangster there, screen right, who's just stepping forward and crushing his cigarette, is Daisuke Kato, who appears in Seven Samurai and appears in a number of Kurosawa's pictures. All of these guys are dressed a little ostentatiously. There's a slightly comic tone that they have in this scene that a lot of Kurosawa's gangsters have. He doesn't quite take the yakuza fully seriously. And when he portrays them in movies like this, or Drunken Angel, or Stray Dog, they have a slightly exaggerated quality. This is one of the most haunting of the close-ups of Watanabe's face. Again, the light is very bright, suggesting a kind of transcendent quality that he has. And it's the look that unnerves others. Coming out now is Seiji Miyaguchi, who plays the master swordsman in Seven Samurai. He's got an opaque face, and we get a fisheye lens, the most extreme wide-angle shot of Watanabe's face, really distorting its perspective, and we go back to this shot of Miyaguchi. Then he walks away, and we've got a really interesting series of intercut close-ups as he turns and looks back at Watanabe, with Fujiwara in the midground. Here's the first of them. He turns, he looks back, sees the old guy. Fujiwara turns and looks, and then looks back down the hall at the head gangster, who's just conferred with the deputy mayor, and looks back at him. And then another look. So this is an important moment. There's something happening here. And perhaps this is a little fanciful, but I like to think of this scene as gangster zen. There's a moment that passes between the head gangster and Watanabe that's conveyed in that fisheye lens perspective of the old man's face. And perhaps this lead gangster is an honorable guy after all, and he sees something in Watanabe that he chooses not to interfere with, and therefore the gangsters back down from their plan to pursue the tavern project. That's my way of making sense of this oblique element in the story. So really, when you look closely at this movie, there are more gaps in the story than one at first appreciates. There's a lot of mystery to the film, and a lot of things that Kurosawa could have filled in very explicitly for us, but chose to leap over. When Fujiwara says Watanabe must have known he had cancer, we're now 30 minutes into the wake sequences, and only now have the co-workers begun to entertain this idea. Look at the detailing on this banister post, how scuffed and aged this element of the set appears, as if countless hands have gripped it in their passage through the bureaucracy. This is another tribute to the care that Kurosawa put into his sets. He loved using aged wood to enhance the realism of his sets by making the structures look old, worn, even slightly decayed by time. He's most famous for doing this in his castle sets in the samurai pictures like Throne of Blood and Ran, but his modern-day films reflect the same desire to use production design to provide a sense of historical realism. You can see this at work on his very first picture, Sanshiro Sugata, with set design by Masao Totsuka. Shu Matsuyama designed these sets for Ikiru, and Muraki did those castles in the samurai films. This shows us how powerful Kurosawa's artistic tastes were. The same thing happens when he works with different cinematographers. The basic visual design remains the same, even as the partnership with production personnel changes. We're going now into a scene that has some special meaning for Kurosawa. It's an exceptionally beautiful one, and it sets up the film's last shot as a reprise of the imagery that you see here, the imagery of the clouds. These clouds link to a deep structure of meaning in Kurosawa's work, for which he customarily used this kind of imagery. When he wanted to counterpoint the finitude of human life with a sense of greater purpose, mystery, or spirit, his characters will gaze at the heavens, or his camera will do so. The cloud imagery provides a vision of cosmic design that reorients their thinking. The last shot that he ever filmed in Madadayo is a transcendent image of clouds, and it's there in his first film, Sanshiro Sugata. Sugata gazes skyward, sees a cloud that reminds him of a lotus flower, and the vision saves his life. Ran features very abundant cloud imagery, but it's more ominous there, suggesting a cosmic order that endemic human violence has thrown out of balance. Kurosawa was a very secular director. To put it differently, he never lost the Marxist outlook of his early youth that saw life as a materialist process, defined by conditions of history and economy. Seven Samurai, for example, is virtually a discourse on this idea. And yet there were times when he wanted to reach for a sense of transcendent meaning or irresolvable mystery, and at those times he would use his cloud imagery. In this sense, it evokes one of life's great tragedies and paradoxes. We believe that death is something that happens to other people, not to ourselves, and that we have all the time in the world. It makes us indifferent to beauty. Now that time has run out for Watanabe, he is no longer indifferent to beauty. Problem is, he has no time for it. Now Kurosawa begins to set up the really tragic thrust of the film. Watanabe's co-workers are finally accepting the idea that the old man knew he was dying of cancer and nevertheless managed to do his job in an exemplary fashion. All of their job frustrations are beginning to pour out, and they're going to condemn the inefficiency of the bureaucracy, speaking honestly in ways that they never have done among themselves before. Hara here, for example, the character played by Bakuzen Hidari, is in a fit of drunken spite, and he's becoming very obstreperous and insulting about all of them. This kind of honesty, though, carries a price. If you're going to hang on to it, as Watanabe did, it will change your life. Otherwise, it has to be abandoned or repressed. And that's what Kurosawa is going to show us now, the abandoning of this insight by Watanabe's colleagues. The moral lesson that the old man's last days exemplified, doing good for others, caring for the weak and vulnerable, is the crux of heroism for Kurosawa. And Watanabe is one of Kurosawa's greatest heroes. His example is inspiring, and Kurosawa wants it to inspire the audience. There are values here that Kurosawa wants to convey to his viewers. At the same time, though, there's a real darkness in this film, and I don't just mean because of the subject of death. There's a real darkness about society here. If this second section is all about the reaction of society to Watanabe, Kurosawa is showing us that society cannot change in response to Watanabe's example. There is no hope of redeeming or reforming the larger context. The only hope lies in small acts of charity, such as building a playground. But these are not powerful enough to transform the structural problems that deform people's lives. There are plenty of other unhealthy sumps in the city, and almost certainly no Watanabe there to intervene. So Kurosawa is moving beyond the kind of heroism that he showed in earlier pictures like Drunken Angel and Stray Dog, when he had not yet foreclosed on the idea of social change. In Ikiru, he has foreclosed on it. Thus, Watanabe's inspiring example is like a beacon surrounded by an ocean of darkness. The forces resisting the heroic transformation of society are getting much stronger in Kurosawa's work, and Ikiru gives us one of Kurosawa's supreme affirmations of individual heroism, and at the same time, a ruthless portrait of why it won't work, except in a limited sense. This combination of qualities gives his work an interesting and really rich aspect. On the one hand, there's a desire to believe in the possibility of change in Kurosawa, and there's a tragic sense that it's not going to work. And that tension between those two becomes very powerful in a movie like Ikiru. The bureaucrats are really loosened up now, and Kurosawa's blocking has changed. In place of the stiff formality and a lot of the linear patterns that we've had earlier, we start to get a lot of diagonal movement across the frame, from background to foreground, and camera moves, dolly moves, that mimic this kind of diagonal quality. They pour out their frustrations, their infuriation about the difficulties under which they have to work. And during all of this time, Watanabe's family becomes relatively invisible. Mitsu is there, he's hearing all of this, but he's off camera for the most part, as Kurosawa concentrates on the reactions of Watanabe's co-workers. This reflects the sociology of Watanabe's life. Watanabe's family, after all, although an important part of his life, was not the primary part of his life. The primary component was work. It was the job, and it was the co-workers. And so they come to the fore here in a way that gives us the social portrait that I was talking about earlier. This is a wonderful camera move. We come in close on Kimura in a way that isolates him from the others and brings him to prominence as he gives them a look that says, I know you guys are all full of it. There's a bit of disgust here and a cut to the portrait as Kimura looks at it with new understanding and a real appreciation for Watanabe. And now his emblematic hat makes another appearance. The housekeeper brings it in, and everybody stares at it in a kind of drunken stupor. They don't understand that hat. In fact, nobody in the film does. And the hat is going to introduce the appearance of the policeman who has brought it to the house and wants to offer his prayers at the wake. Kurosawa brings this character on in a very theatrical way. We're near the end of the film now, and the character comes in to make a decisive last-minute appearance that is critically timed in order to give us a crucial piece of information about the story, about the state of Watanabe on the evening of his death. Kurosawa has built the second section of the film, the funeral section, as something of a mystery story. How did Watanabe manage to build the park? Well, we're never really going to get a full answer to that question outside of the flashbacks that we've seen. How was he at the time of his death? Was his death in the park a suicide? Was it a social protest, as the mothers believe? You can see the way Mitsu hangs onto this hat. He desperately wants some answers because he knows that he understands so little about his father. The way he hangs on that hat gives us a measure of his desperation. One of the terrible suspicions that Kurosawa has about the nature of human life is the process of psychological alienation, of estrangement, the fact that our personal realities don't coincide with those of other people. Rashomon was an exploration of this idea in the flashbacks that don't cohere one to the other. And you can see the reprise of that idea in Ikiru, the tremendous difficulty that people have making sense of Watanabe's behavior and their failure to agree on even what that behavior means. So the flashbacks have shown us to some degree how Watanabe managed to impose his will on the bureaucracy. But now we are about to be given a special glimpse of the old man in his final moments. And the policeman is going to give us that glimpse. And Kurosawa builds a lot of tension about this long pause before he begins to speak, and then he does so in a very formalized way. He faces the camera directly in a frontal fashion.
Yeah.
And tells us that they met last night at the park. And really, in some ways, this is what we've been waiting for in the last section of the film. We want this privileged glimpse of Watanabe at the moment of his passing. Watanabe on the swing in that snow, not drunk, but in a state of ecstasy, is perhaps the last thing that we were expecting. And the cop blames himself. Perhaps if he had intervened, the old guy wouldn't have died. And after this long preamble, Kurosawa kind of teasing us by delaying the flashback, he at last takes us into it with the odd news that the old man was singing. And of course, we know what song that must be. Here we are. This extraordinary scene is one of the great passages in all of Kurosawa's work. It's the epiphany within the film, and it's Watanabe's epiphany within the story. The setup and framing are so simple. A reprise of Song of the Gondola, which is Watanabe's theme, it's become his theme. Expressing the bittersweet nature of life, it accompanies this slow camera move, and the framing is very distant. We look through the bars of the jungle gym in the falling snow. The distanced framing telling us that this is a special moment. It's a moment of reverence that we have to enter slowly and with respect. The movie has been so controlled that this moment of pathos, so openly expressed, and only the second such moment in the film, becomes astonishingly powerful, and it's the scene that everyone remembers from the movie. It's one of Shimura's great moments, the kind of scene that he could do so well and that Toshiro Mifune really could not. Kurosawa allows Watanabe's song to finish over the present tense of the film, accompanying that dissolve to the portrait, as if his spirit is lingering in the minds of all assembled. So it turns out that the old man was at peace when he died. Kurosawa's exploration of individualism has a number of roots. Partly it comes from the occupation period and the stress on individualism that the Americans brought to Japan. There's also a lot of emphasis on individual excellence and heroics in the samurai tradition that Kurosawa loves so much. And so his dilemma as an artist is how to reconcile this new ethic that emerged after the war in the official Reformation project with a cultural tradition that stresses the group and joint norms for individual behavior. In pictures like Ikiru, where he shows with overwhelming power the negative influence of the group, you see him giving that question one inflection. But in his very next picture, Seven Samurai, he gives us a much more positive depiction of group solidarity, group loyalty, and the way that individual excellence is, in that film at least, a function of coexisting within the group. So from film to film, he would sometimes change his inflection and his emphases. And it's this that gives his work a tremendous variety and richness. Significantly, Kimura, the one bureaucrat who knows better, has walked off into the background of the shot and looks with reverence at Watanabe, the suggestion here that we might have the beginning of a master-pupil relationship. Perhaps Kimura will learn and live accordingly. But the coda is going to be much bleaker. We see Fujiwara as the new Watanabe, sitting at the old desk, performing the same meaningless, deadening paper shuffle. And Kurosawa reprises events that we had at the beginning, giving the film obviously a sense of finality and completion. We've got more petitioners coming forward, and by reprising that element, he's able to suggest the power of the bureaucracy to prevail. It prevailed over the attempted reforms of the Allies, and it's prevailed over Watanabe and the example his behavior has set. So Kimura stands up to object, and I love the way Fujiwara takes off his glasses. Look at that. The gesture is one of such contempt and arrogance. He knows that this protest is not going to be very long-lived. This, I think, is one of Kurosawa's most astonishingly brilliant camera moves in the entire picture. As Kimura sinks, Kurosawa dollies the camera downward so that the camera moves with him in a way that allows that stack of paper to obliterate his presence. And we have a wipe to our final scene. Despite this bleakness, there is the park, and there are those children at play there. And this is Watanabe's legacy. He did make things better for these people. Kurosawa began this film by wondering, as we all do, about the nature of death. In Kurosawa's case, it seems to have occasioned a unique kind of anxiety. With remarkable self-possession, he wondered how he could die when there was so much work left for him to do, so many films yet to make. This film came from that anxiety. Kurosawa was a man who defined himself through his work. He wasn't given to much small talk. Making films was his life. In Ikiru, then, he supplied a very personal answer to his question. You are alive if you are doing meaningful work. Given who he was, it's the answer Kurosawa was bound to formulate. And so he brings the perspectives of the two sections together. We see the park and the haunted contemplation of Kimura, burdened by what he knows and unable to act on it. Kurosawa gives us one of his supreme statements on personal heroism, but couples it with a condemnation of the post-war world. And he ends with the heavens, that emblematic image for him of those mysteries that lie beyond the finitude of human life.